Okay, I think we'll get started just so we can have the most time to chat. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today to talk about a new, very exciting book by Osita Nwanevu. As a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, Osita researches democracy and political economy with an emphasis on economic democracy and local politics. He's also a contributing editor at The New Republic and a columnist at The Guardian. His new book is called The Right of the People, Democracy and the Case for a New American Founding. The book is, in some ways, a warning against taking democracy for granted and exploring how we should aspire to make the project of American democracy fully realized. So, we're going to have a great chat with Osita, and then we'll have time for a question and answer portion at the end. So, if you think of a question as we go, jot it down. At that point, we can have folks go off mute or use the chat. Either is fine. But first, we'll get started with Osita. Thank you so much for joining us. Can we start by hearing from you with a sort of brief intro to an overview of your new book?
Sure thing, and thank you again for having me. So yeah, this is a book about democracy, and it was a book written with the idea that I didn't really get the sense that we had a very clear understanding of what democracy was. It's a word that was so live in our politics today, obviously. Um, but I really wanted to take an opportunity to step back from the news cycle and to think through what the concept means, what it obligates us to, how it might help us understand the defects of some of our political institutions, how it might help us understand the state of our economy. And yeah, I think the book clarified a lot for me. I hope it'll clarify a lot for readers too. But beyond that clarification, I think it does offer a kind of vision of what American democracy could be that might help us resolve some of our most pressing political and economic problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, to your point, I would love to start there with the basics. So, you emphasize early on in the book that we're going to have a hard time defending democracy if we don't have a collective definition of it. So, we know there's been a lot of talk about defending democracy, but you rightfully point out we can't necessarily assume that people know what we mean when we say that. So, before we dive deeper in, can you offer up your definition and vision of democracy from the book?
Sure thing. So I think that democracy is a system in which the governed govern. You can read a lot of dry and dusty, boring political science books and political theory books. I've done a lot of that work for you. But I think the most succinct definition you get out of that experience is democracy is a system in which the governed themselves, those subject to government, are actually the ones governing and making the decisions. It's not given over to some king. It's not given over to some upper class, higher class of oligarchs or aristocrats. The people themselves are doing this. Another good formulation of this is Abraham Lincoln's government of, by, and for the people. And that sounds intuitive, but I think it obligates us to a lot of things that we don't necessarily see in our political system and in our economy. I think there are three basic characteristics of any democracy that's worth being called a democracy. The first is political equality. Everybody has to come to a democratic choice, or political choice rather, in equal standing for it to be a democracy. If some privileged minority of people has a different standing than others, then you leave open the door to having not the governed as the whole governing, but some subset of privileged people within the society. Um, Second characteristic is responsiveness. Democracy is not a suggestion box. When the people act collectively, that means something. They speak and act with some authority, and things have to happen as a consequence of that. And the third thing is majoritarianism. Of all of the different ways that we could conceivably make a collective choice, majority rule is the one that's most consistent with the principle of equality. Obviously, impossible to get unanimous agreement, forms of unanimous agreement actually end up privileging the last people to agree to a choice. It privileges the last holdouts in a given situation. Um, and obviously, minority rule is no longer acceptable or isn't acceptable either. Uh, Majority rule works. If two people want something and three people want some other thing, very hard for the two to get over the three unless there's some kind of fundamental inequality involved. So those are the three pillars to me, three legs of the stool: equality, responsiveness, majority rule. And as intuitive as they sound, as commonsensical as they might sound, I think that our political system flouts them in pretty basic ways.
Yes, and I think that brings us to how we fall short, right? So in the book, you talk a lot about the problems with our current democratic system. And there are a lot, and we won't be able to get to all of them today. Really encourage people to read the book. But could you give us an overview, a few of like the most important ways that the US political system to you falls short of truly being democratic? And would love to hear a few of those key solutions that you propose in the book.
Sure thing. So I think equality, right off the bat, you run into very, very basic problems. The idea that we should all be in equal standing, no matter who we happen to be, no matter what our personal characteristics are, but also no matter where we happen to live arbitrarily. We have a political system that flouts that basic principle in pretty stark ways. We have an example of this in the news right now, Washington, D.C., under a kind of occupation. This is a city of 700,000 people or so without full representation in the federal government. They have a non-voting delegate, Ella Holmes Norton, who doesn't actually have the ability to vote on the final passage of legislation in Congress. And there are actually 4 million Americans for whom this is true. So they are governed by the federal government without any actual direct say, full and equal say in federal governance. Right off the bat, that's democratically untenable. Because I think many people have come to understand now, even those of us who do have representation, have the representation distributed very unequally. Classic example is the United States Senate. So this is a body where, because each state gets equal representation regardless of population, Wyoming, state of fewer people, in fact, than Washington, D.C., fewer than 600,000 people, has the same representation of California, the state of about 40 million people through its own country, be one of the 40 largest in the world, one of the largest economies in the world. Same representation. So in effect, that means mathematically that people in Wyoming have about 67 times the representation in the Senate that people in California do. And that's not just an academic fact that matters for policymaking. We're told that this is balanced out in some respect by the House. We can get into the House, has its own problems. But it's not balanced out. I mean, the Senate has its own distinct and important powers. The Senate shapes the judiciary, it shapes the executive branch. And obviously, you need both houses of Congress in order to pass even ordinary legislation. And so those inequities actually really profoundly shape the policy process. And again, flout democratic principles in very basic ways. Most Americans already think the Electoral College is a not very good system. They kind of understand that. But when you comes to things like the judiciary, we have a lot of animus and anger right now about the composition of the Supreme Court. In the House, we have this gerrymandering conversation we're in now. We're seeing over the last couple of months a lot of debates about executive power. There are all kinds of places where I think the system as it's been handed to us, this 238-year-old framework, is, some people would say breaking down, but I actually think in certain respects was not created to be democratic in the way that we might value democracy today, and is failing us on that basis.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think because this is a Roosevelt Institute conversation, I want to bring us to the next section of the book, which is about how to build a democratic economy. So here you're doing something we don't always see in conversations about democracy, where you're making the point that until we have a democratic economy, we will not have a true democracy. So can you dive into this a little bit for us and tell us what you mean when you say, like, we do not live in a democratic economy, and why that has to be a crucial part of this larger conversation about democracy?
Right. So I think you have to go back to some of the first principles I was talking about. Democracy being a system in which the governed are themselves governing. Why do we like that? Why do we value that as a system? I think the intuition, or one of the intuitions is, each and every one of us has some rights to shape the conditions of our lives. We're not just helpless victims of circumstance. We're not just being under the thumb of people who are richer and more powerful than us. We have some agency to shape our own personal lives and the societies we live in. That I think is the basic democratic intuition. It's why we think we should have the right to vote, the right to govern ourselves in that respect. But I think there's been a lot of conversation, especially in recent years, about other places in life where we are governed. Where else are we subject to authority? And I think one of the major places we are is within the economy, including at work. Decisions that are made at the top of the companies we work for often affect us more directly, intimately, and immediately than decisions made in Washington, D.C., or a state capital, or a city hall. We spend about a third of our lives at work. This is where we derive our livelihoods, but we have very little democratic agency, any agency of any kind, really, to shape our basic working conditions, especially now that the labor movement has been decimated. That's a democratic problem. It is theoretically, and I think both practically, an issue that somebody who works at Amazon, let's say, for instance, can go to the polls, and I think they should, every couple of years to have their voice heard on what a foreign policy should be, maybe with respect to Russia or China or Iran. But there's no place in their life where they can actually say, this is how I think Amazon should be run, except maybe through an appeal to a political system that happens to be dominated by their bosses at Amazon. There's no real place for them to exercise or have their voice heard on those basic conditions that they face day in and day out. That's a democratic problem, and I think it's one that actually contributes to inequality and makes inequality so hard for us to solve. And so, yeah, one of the provocations I make in this book is there's a democratic issue there with the lack of power workers have, and I think there are democratic solutions. I think there are ways in which we can empower workers anew in this country that would not just assuage our troubles about democratic theory at work, but also help us deliver goods to ordinary people who deserve more pay, better conditions from working they have now.
Yeah, definitely. This section of the book was so fascinating to read because, I mean, you talk about something that we often hear, which is like we just need to send the general public to remedial civics classes, and that's how we'll recommit to our democratic ideals. But you bring up that it can be really hard for an ordinary American to feel committed to the project of democracy without a material connection to it. Yeah, and I loved the way you talked about the workplace as this place where, yeah, Americans are not even just governed, but often dominated, and in the ways in which that impacts democracy. So, would love to hear a little bit about how you see unions and labor power as one way to build a stronger connection between just the people and the ideal of democracy.
Right. I mean, I think it's actually really dangerous for democracy if people look at the question of democracy and they say to themselves, well, I'm being asked on the one hand to make a choice in favor of an abstract system, a civics class, so the principles, and my own material well-being. They're disconnected. Um, I think a lot of people in that scenario actually choose the material well-being, but they don't have to. I think that we can make an argument to people that democracy is actually a system that empowers them and empowers them in ways that are not just theoretical, but that again deliver them better pay, better working conditions. And unions are a great example of how this is so. I mean, I think that a union is a democratic institution formed either by majority assent or consensus. They then become institutions that empower workers, allow them voice that they would not otherwise have, both within the workplace, obviously, when it comes to negotiating for better paying conditions, but also in Washington. And unions are one of the few institutions that go to DC and advocate on the behalf not of corporations, not of trade groups, but ordinary working people themselves. And that sort of improves their democratic agency, even in that political sense. But there's this other aspect of this too that I've thought a lot about, which is, democracy takes practice. It's an embodied system of doing things. And some of the skills that we need to participate in politics well, how to make arguments, how to compromise, how to get together with people who are different from you to solve problems. Um, there aren't very many places outside of elections where we're asked to do this on a regular basis in our lives. But unions and I think other institutions where workers come together and empower themselves can actually be great training grounds for some of those basic skills, those basic civic capacities. And they certainly, I think, perform this function when unions were stronger in this country. Um, so all of this is to say, I think that there's a real way in which, the political and economic here are united. That people shouldn't take for granted that they're separated. Could also talk a lot about too, as I think people in political science do when they get around to talking about the economy, which is not often, obviously the role of money in politics. If workers maybe had more power at work, maybe had more power within corporations, you'd find those corporations using their money in politics in different ways, not using it to suppress what workers are entitled to as much as they do now. So in all of these ways, I think that these two spheres are connected. And again, I think we really do ourselves a disservice as people who hope to protect and preserve democracy when we imply to people that they're separated in some way. We imply to people that there is not a common project here that unites both of these worlds.
Yeah, yeah, I love the concept of democracy as a practice that we can do just amongst ourselves. There's also a part in the book in which you talk about like how besides unionization, we can reform corporate governance and give other ways to give workers more power at work. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about your proposals for worker ownership and cooperatives and the like?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think it's obviously really, really important to re-empower traditional unions in this country. I talk about certain legislation in this that would perhaps do that. But I think there are also a lot of other tools that we can use to build worker power within firms. I think we can take a lot of lessons here from Europeans who have a really kind of complex labor infrastructure that includes traditional unions, yes, but also sectoral bargaining. So beyond having people to make these, firm by firm, workplace by workplace agreements, which is really, really hard to do at scale, you have these master agreements that cover, maybe thousands of workers across an entire sector. And that's a place where you could have actually workers sitting at a table with corporate owners and representatives from the state to hash things out together. Um, they have works councils in some places where within the structure of a given firm, you have a body that's there to resolve disputes, talk about layoffs and why they're justified, whether they're justified. That's built into the structure. It's not a union, but it's something that can coexist with the union as well. Um, and yeah, all the way up to a proposal the, to basically allow workers to earn a share, be given a share of ownership in the companies that they work for, that would give them voting rights and would pay out a dividend. As it stands now, we basically take it for granted that the people who have a role in owning and governing corporations are often investors at Wall Street, right? Who have nothing to do with actually building a business, don't work there, but just have enough money to pay for the stock. Well, why can't we offer that to the people who actually work in the business, give them a say as shareholders, just as much as the investors have? So these are all things that I think are worth talking about and exploring. I think that a lot of these ideas are not really active in the American political context, the American policy debates on worker power, but they ought to be. I think that the labor infrastructure we have now is not really doing as much for us as it could. And we should be thinking creatively about how to expand worker power in new ways, both substantively, but also, I think that, again, if we want to convince people that democracy can deliver for them materially, I think it would help to present them with new ideas that sound fresh and exciting on this front.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the new ideas in the book were really what struck me. And so while we're on that kind of positive bent, let's talk a little bit more about solutions. So you make a lot of bold proposals, some of which you've touched on already, about how we can actually have some hope in this area. And so can we just chat a little bit more about some of the proposals that we haven't yet covered? I think there's a lot in the political section that we haven't talked about yet that are very important.
Sure thing, sure thing. Yeah, so there's like a laundry list of things to consider. These are not all things that I think can or even should be done tomorrow, the next year. I think it's going to take a long time to build a consensus around some of these proposals that we would need to have them happen. I think that what I'm advocating for really is a kind of generational project of building democracy gradually over a long period of time. But there are some things that I think within the near to medium term seem feasible, both as far as our political system and our economic system is concerned. I talk about things like the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, for instance, when it comes to the Electoral College. Um, Again, I think many people in this country already think the Electoral College is bad. I know that I have to spend time relitigating that argument here. But it would be very, very daunting to try to change that by the traditional constitutional amendment process. And we have one of the hardest constitutions in the world to amend, people have said. But states actually have the power to decide how their electoral votes are allocated. And they can decide, and many states have already, to allocate their votes to the winner of the national popular vote. And so there's a compact. I think there are a number of states with about 200 or so electoral votes already in this compact, where once they hit 270, all of those states' electoral votes will go to the winner of the national popular vote, and you've basically obviated the electoral college without a constitutional amendment. I think that's a great reform. I think it would face certain legal challenges, but it's worth talking about and pursuing and fighting for it. We talked about the Washington, D.C. earlier here, and I think that D.C. Residents have been pretty straightforwardly supportive of statehood for some time in this country now. And that's something that Congress could do. It's not something that takes constitutional amendment. Congress can simply pass legislation admitting new states to the Union. This could happen for DC. It can happen and be offered to territories should they want to join the Union as well. The judiciary, we are one of the few judiciaries, if not the only judiciary in the world, that has lifetime appointments for people on the high bench. It's an insane system. It shouldn't be the case that you are, on waiting with bated breath after somebody falls in the Supreme Court to find out where they're going to have abortion rights. It's a crazy system. So people have proposed all kinds of nonpartisan reforms, post-partisan reforms that would cycle judges maybe up from the lower court onto the bench. I think the most likely thing in the near future is the addition of new justices on the bench to deal with or balance out the majority we have now. So there's a kind of wide menu of policy reforms on the political side that it would take much longer than we have to get through. I should talk about gerrymandering too. I mean, people are up in arms about that now. I think we should do what we can to outlaw partisan gerrymandering. I think that's a commonsensical reform. You shouldn't be able, as a politician, to draw yourself the electorate you want, to draw your opponents out of office. But I think there are also a lot of other issues with our system of representation as it stands now. Even if we got rid of partisan gerrymandering, it wouldn't be very equal and equitable for nerdy reasons. Again, I don't think we have time to get into. But I will say that moving to a system of proportional representation, where you're not just electing one person from a district, but you are maybe electing multiple people from different districts. And so it's not the case that just one Democrat or just one Republican gets elected, but you actually have a system where people are proportionally given seats based on how much their party wins in the election. It would provide, I think, a more democratic way to conduct elections in this country. It'd provide the opportunity maybe for third and other parties to get representation in Congress that they wouldn't otherwise have. So yeah, there's a lot of very wonky stuff. I don't want to bore people with the details, but on that side too. But yeah, I mean, I think that overall, both the political side and the economic side of this constitute one holistic democratic agenda. I think we have a dearth of democracy in this country, and these two aspects of it can be joined together in saying that we want a country where people do have the chance, do have the opportunity to direct their own lives, to have a real equitable say in how our society and how our country function. And these are two sides of the same coin in achieving that goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, thank you so much. It's nice to have a little hope around these topics. And I think we're gonna turn to Q&A. And so let me just see if anyone wants to come off mute. Please feel free to use the raise hand function. We're a small group, so we can really have a conversation. Or you can put your Q&A in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I'm being told my camera is flashing, so I'm just going to turn it off for a second while we see if anyone comes through. But I'm here. Sorry to be blinding everyone. Oh, I see one raised hand. Bilal, go ahead.
Thank you. Osita, you end the book with a striking quote from Orson Welles. And one sort of maybe not so policy-centric call to action that you leave us with is you say that this is a country that runs on grand political visions, I think. And you also say that cultivating those visions is part of the work, or should be, I think you called it a competency. So we're a policy think tank. We don't really generate grand visions. We work on the nitty-gritty of policy. But I think there's some danger in that too. So like, how can we work to cultivate those grand visions? Yeah, and who should do that work, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's a question that's also reflective of my own journey. I mean, I went to policy school myself back a million years ago in 2015. And, I thought that American politics would work out in a different way than it has over the last decade. And we are in a place where people are asking fundamental questions about our society. What does it mean to be an American? Is our country a democracy? Is democracy good? These kinds of very, very broad questions are the level at which many ordinary people are now engaging in politics. And I think that they're looking at our society from that lens and finding it kind of wanting in many respects. I mean, there's a poll that Gallup did early last year where they found more than 70% of Americans were dissatisfied with American democracy and the way it was working. Did all those people have, the right solutions, the right diagnosis of what was wrong? No, I don't think so. But I think that there's an intuition that our political institutions aren't functioning in the way they ought to if we care about representing and caring for ordinary people. And so obviously it's very, very important for us to be, granular in policy analyses, saying the right things, doing the homework of crafting policies and analyzing them. But I think that in doing that, we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there are many Americans who want, and I think justifiably want, really, really, really big change. And if we're not speaking to that need, if we're not speaking to that desire, I think it's not only going to leave us kind of irrelevant, but I think, again, it's also kind of dangerous if the people who, on the other hand, are offering these grand visions are not democratic, are not believing in sustaining, talking about the importance of democracy. I think that our society, stands a real chance of falling apart in an important way. So, yeah, I think that both sides of this are important, and everybody has their own role and the things that they're best suited to do. I've just found myself more and more as a writer gravitating towards these larger questions because I think they resonate with me personally, but also because I think we're in a moment where people who cover politics, write about politics, make arguments about politics, have to be meeting the public on that level.
Thank you.
I see in the chat, would love to hear more about the House and ways we might make that more representative.
Yeah, I talked about proportional representation, but I think we'd also talk about just enlarging the House too. I mean, the size of the House has been frozen for some time, and that leads to really, really large districts that are less democratically accessible than smaller districts. This is one of the aspects of our design that actually reflects, I think, the intentions of the founders. I go through much of the book saying, did not really believe in democracy in the way that certainly I believe in democracy, and I think that the ways that much of us want to believe in democracy today. So Madison believed that if you had large districts, it would be much harder for people to engage in democratic politics unless they had the resources and respect of, a wealthier person. And that would quell the ability of the public to engage in populist economic reform. I think that, I think it's kind of reflected in a lot of ways that Congress works today. And I think that one of the things that's sustaining that is that the House districts have gotten so large. So people have said we can expand the House more in addition to fundamentally reforming the system of representation, proportional representation. We could just have a larger chamber, and that would improve things somewhat in other ways.
Yeah. Yes. The see if anyone has a question, but I have a follow-up about that. That part of the book is really fascinating. The founders, important. Anyone else? Yeah, so I'll ask that. I mean, I thought that was a really helpful provocation in your book. Like the questions around, we get really hung up on like, well, what did the founders intend that shapes so many of our conversations around this. So yeah, talk a little bit more about that, about like what they did or did not intend vis-a-vis democracy. And because I think what you do is, like you say, we can take agency to imagine beyond that.
Yeah. So I mean, this is one of the most important parts of the book, I think, and one of the parts that was most important for me to work through. When people say, as all of us have heard, well, the United States is a republic and not a democracy, and so when you talk about how unequal things are, that's just what the founders intended. There are a couple of things wrong with that, and I think that one important thing that is kind of right, things that we need to wrestle with. The first thing that's wrong with it is that this is a basic is-oughts conflict, right? The fact that things are a certain way does not mean that things should be that way. So the fact that the United States, from a conservative perspective, is a certain kind of republic doesn't mean that we are bound to be that in any kind of substantive or moral or, policy way. It's just a description of the status quo. And for me, the status quo is never an argument for itself. That being said, though, I think that the conservatives are onto something. I think that when other people tend to say in response, well, the United States is a democracy because all the founders meant in creating a republic, as they said they were doing, was that they were not going to create a system like Athens with a direct democracy. They believed in representative democracy, and that's all the founders meant by republicanism. I don't think that's actually true. It's not the historical record. So republicanism, as I describe in the book, is a system in which power is distributed in some way. There might be a written constitution and the rule of law and checks and balances and different branches and so on, but power is distributed. And there are democratic versions of that. In fact, I think what I'm arguing for in the book is a kind of democratic republic. And there are not democratic versions of that. And by the time the founders came together to write the Constitution in 1787, most of the examples of republicanism that they were drawing from, influenced by, were not democratic. The Roman Republic, had certain popular features, but was not a representative majoritarian democracy in the sense that we understand it now. The Italian maritime republics of the Middle Ages and Renaissance, there was voting, but it was voting for a certain class of merchant elites. That was the republic that they constructed. And I think very similarly, and the founders said this in passages that I talk about in the book, during the convention, so on. They said straightforwardly that American governance after the revolution had been too democratic, and that they're creating a system that would be less democratic, less accessible to the public, less capable of passing certain populist economic reforms that they were worried about. And I think that's the source of a lot of the problems that we still have today, even though we've improved things, certainly. We have the direct election of senators now, more people can vote, these kinds of things. At the same time, I think certain basic features of the design have retained themselves, remained. And I think that they are challenges to creating a truly democratic government. And so that's kind of what I try to work through in chapter 4. There's a lot of historical unpacking of the founding. But I think that the overall point is to resolve that question, which I think comes up in our politics all the time, is, are we a republic or are we a democracy? I think we're certainly a kind of republic that's not very democratic, and that does not mean that we should not become a more democratic republic moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? Feel free to just unmute or use the chat. Especially if I don't see you. I can ask another one. I think I found, back to the money and politics piece, I found the book to be a little bit more of an opening conversation around the ways that money and politics are dangerous, even beyond what we would first think of, which would be like campaign contributions, lobbying, Citizens United, which of course you're like, those are major barriers.
Yeah.
But you also talk about these more insidious ways, like these less obvious ways that money influence politics and how that relates to democracy. I would love to sort of hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure thing. So as you say, I think the campaign and finance reform is important, lobbying reform is important, Citizens United, all of these things that we end up talking about a lot already in our democratic policy discourse, those things matter. But one of the reasons why I think talking about inequality within the economy is so important is that beyond those direct ways in which people try to influence a political system, concentrations of wealth can also influence politics, even if nobody's writing a check, even if nobody's a registered lobbyist. One of the basic ways, is many of the people who are elected to politics are themselves very, very wealthy people. We should figure out ways to do something about that, get more representation for ordinary folks. But look, I, as a journalist, know, and I think this is true of people who work on the Hill and people who are themselves politicians, when I'm looking to learn about a policy issue, I'll turn to maybe a think tank or a publication of some kind that is designed to put out reports or things on those issues. Oftentimes, those are funded by very wealthy people or very funded by corporations. Nobody's donating to a campaign that shapes people's understanding of certain policies and the kinds of policies that are worth advocating for and supporting. One other thing I think about a lot is the news media. Most of the media in this country is for profit, driven by advertising. That in itself creates certain conflicts of interest. How do you report accurately and fairly on a company that might be advertising or could be advertising with you? But even beyond that, there's a paper that I read a couple of years ago that talked about the role that economic metrics play in economics coverage, right? So when you go home and watch the evening news, if this is the thing that people still do, I don't really do it. You hear every day about, the Dow Jones went up or down this amount, or, there's a report that GDP did this or that. Those metrics, while important, often aren't very connected to what ordinary people are experiencing within the economy, right? I think that the top 10% of people in this country control over or own about 93% of the stock in this country. So there's swings up and down Wall Street. Most people own some stock, but the people who it really, really matters for are the people at the very top of the economy already. And so when the news media reports certain things about those, and those are the ways in which we understand that the economy is doing well or poorly, that actually is a skewed understanding relative to other ways we could try to understand people's economic well-being. And those skewed understandings affect, the way voters think about the economy, the way that politicians do. So there are all kinds of ways in which these things interact with the political system. When, for instance, a company implies, without, again, donating to a campaign, if you pass this policy, we might leave this city, we might leave this state. Otherwise, if you do this, we might actually come to your state, come to your city. That's another important way that it matters. So these are all things that I don't think you can legislate away by doing campaign finance reform. I think that these are all situations that should lead us to thinking structurally about how the economy functions, who has power, who's making decisions, and how are we sort of communicating those decisions to the public. And so it's a broader conversation than I think the money and politics discourse that we're used to.
Definitely. Yeah. I think I saw someone get off video. Was there a question? Okay, maybe I missed that. Yeah, and I feel like another part of that section that was striking me is like thinking through like um income inequality has to be a part of this. Like you talked about, like it's not technically lobbying, but maybe these elected officials send their kids to the same school
Exactly.
as like some of these
Right.
super wealthy one percenters, and then they're in the same social circles. It's just like it's a way more expansive way of thinking about this.
Right.
Yeah. Um, I think I can ask one more if there aren't any more, and then we can end early. But we touched on it a little bit, but I think another interesting part of the book to me was this idea about the will of the people.
Mm.
And I thought it was a more like philosophical part, which was really interesting. Where like maybe there isn't a majority that might agree on like how we're gonna solve all the crises like on our plate, like how to make healthcare more affordable, how to solve gun violence. But it's not always about that like full majority and like this myth of like we
Yeah.
are all going to get on the same page. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you think about that in this conversation?
Sure thing. So this is probably like the most technically complex part of the book. It was a part that I had to wrap my head around a little bit. I mean, again, you can read books with like a lot of formulas that are scary. I don't really want to spend a whole lot of time with. And you come away with, I think, an important conclusion, which is the way that we're used to talking about what happens in an election or what happens in the policy process. Um, you know, these people won. That was the will of the majority or the will of the people. Something very theoretically troubled about that construction of what's going on. Obviously, if you look at polls, for instance, and see that, you know, a majority of Americans believe X on immigration policy. Majority believes this on climate policy. Majority believes this on tax policy. Majority of this believes on certain things about education policy. It's intuitive to us that those are all not the same group of people, right? That there's no one majority that is speaking across all of those issue domains. These are different majorities that exist at the same time. When people go to the polls and vote for one candidate or another candidate, it's intuitive to us, I think, or I should hope, that not all people who voted for that candidate agree on everything or even have the same understanding of what that candidate's going to do. They all came to that person for different reasons. So there's a kind of basic conceptual problem in saying that when an election happens, that's the will of a single, stable, dominant majority of people that's speaking coherently. What I think it's more accurate to say is in an election or a policy process, a majority in a democracy wins, but that's not the only majority that exists in society. And in fact, you could have an election, some other time and have a different majority prevail. Your minority can become a majority. Your majority can shrink to a minority. It's a dynamic process. But what's happening in a democracy is we are establishing a system in which people have the right to govern through fair contests for governing power that are adjudicated on majoritarian basis, which is a more complicated thing. But I think it's truer to what actually happens in the political system. And I think also, too, there's something that is not only misleading, but actually kind of dangerous about talking about the will of the people in this kind of way. You see authoritarians appealing to this. They'll say, you know, you did X or Y because in an election, maybe, we won this particular vote, and that was the single dominant, you know, transcendent will of the entire country, and you were wrong to question it for that reason. If you have an understanding of democracy that's actually more contingent, and you understand that things change and things are dynamic and fluid, that's a more, I think, egalitarian rendering of the whole process. And yeah, that was one of the more important parts of the book to work through. I mean, if we wanted to use up more time, I could talk about errors and possibility theorem, but I really don't want to put people to sleep. But you know, democracy is really, really complicated. Just the tallying of votes is complicated. You know, one other thing to think about in this vein is, depending on your different systems for counting the votes in the first place, you can come to different conclusions. All of this matters. All of this makes democracy really messy. It's hard to perfectly instantiate anything in particular. But I think that, you know, when we act intelligently, we design systems fairly, we have pretty good results. And I think that's reason enough for us to have more faith in the democratic political process. And I think we often are encouraged by events too.
Yes, yeah. I mean, even though the book goes through everything that's wrong with our system, like I did find it hopeful at the end because it was sort of positing that we can imagine our way out of this and we have the power to think about this in different ways. So last call for questions. Give it a minute. Okay. Thank you so, so much, Osita, for joining us. That was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you again for having me.
Yeah. And thanks to everyone who joined. Please stay tuned for updates on our next book club talk. Thank you so much again, and take care.